just want to start off by saying that we're so grateful to be here today, speaking to all of you, to be part of this amazing conference, to close out the day. It's going to be great. Also want to preface that since we're running a little short on time, we're not going to do a Q&A at the end, but our emails are going to be up on the screen at the end. So if you have any questions, feel free to just send us an email. We'd love to get back to you with an answer. So we are here today to talk about reproductive justice for LGBTQ plus youth, particularly in the context of what is going on today. Sure, we all know that right now is a really heated time. There's been a very steady rise of anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment across the nation in really scary ways, particularly anti-transgender. And that's been affecting folks of all ages, and of course particularly affects our youth. And it affects our youth across many different spheres of their lives, not only reproductive justice, just in every aspect of their lives in school, their lives in their personal lives, just all across the whole spectrum. So that can feel really daunting when we think about that, of kind of feels like everything is going crazy and where do I even begin? I'm just one person, or I'm just a very small team at one organization, what can I do? But the really important thing is for us to remember that we're all here together, right? We all share a common goal, and we can all take little pieces of that pie that we can tackle. So today we are focusing specifically on reproductive justice for LGBTQ plus youth. We'll break it down a little bit on how we want to achieve that for our youth, and hopefully send you on your way with some action steps that you can take.
Hey everybody, so happy to be here. Yeah, so we're from the LA LGBT Center. Keilani and I both work together on the RISE team. And today we'll just be focusing on a small slice of what reproductive justice can look like for the folks that we serve, LGBTQ plus youth specifically. We'll be talking about reproductive justice, what that means, we'll be defining it. I know sometimes we can get a little bit confused and sometimes use reproductive rights, reproductive health, and reproductive justice all in the same breath. But today we're going to be talking about what each of those things mean and how they interact with each other within the systems that we work in. And then we'll discuss what sexuality education can look like for the folks we work with as well. And then we'll wrap things up with allyship tips and just different takeaways y'all can get from this little presentation we put together. So we'll start off with a little bit about ourselves. Okay, so yeah, again, my name's Nako. I use they, them pronouns. I kind of started getting into this type of work at a really young age. Both my parents are immigrants, so I grew up in an immigrant community here in Los Angeles. And then I moved out to the Bay Area for college, and so that's where I started to get professional development. And I worked at a couple different resource centers. I worked at a sexual health clinic for a while, and then I came back to LA, and now I'm working on the LA LGBT Center's REST program. And I'll pass it on to Keilani.
So I'm Keilani. I use she, they pronouns. I've been working in direct services with youth, mostly middle school to high school age, for a couple years, and I just recently transitioned into my role at the LA Center, where I do training and coaching along with Nako for folks who are the direct service providers to youth, mostly T-aged youth. So we have a pretty wide perspective on different age groups of youth and working with youth in different settings. So again, if you have questions, then please feel free to email us. So let's get into it.
So we're going to start off by talking about fighting reproductive oppression. And we can't have that conversation without also talking about the lack of accessibility to reproductive care, and mentioning the different ways that this can manifest within the systems that we work with. We could say that reproductive oppression can be categorized amongst the three following groups. So we have reproductive health, which is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being in all manners relating to the reproductive system and to its functions and processes. And then we have reproductive rights, which include prenatal services, safe childbirth, and access to contraception. This also can look like access to legal and safe abortions, and just making sure that folks know what abortion bans look like and how they can be impacted by that. And then lastly, we have reproductive justice, which is a framework, a movement, and a vision. And that means that when it's achieved, that each person will have the power to make their own informed decisions about their body, sexuality, and future regardless of race, income, class, sexual orientation, immigration status, and/or other factors. So today we're going to be focusing again on reproductive justice, And reproductive justice is the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, social, and economic well-being of all people. Yeah. And it's important to emphasize that this is not a woman's issue because many LGBTQ plus people, including lesbian, bisexual, transgender folks, two-spirit folks, intersex folks, and gender nonconforming individuals can get pregnant, use birth control, have abortions, carry pregnancies, and become parents. So they aren't exceptions to the widespread impact of the lack of reproductive justice. And in reproductive justice, there are three main prongs that are widely recognized by activists and lawmakers alike. So the first one is the right to have a child. This can look like the continuous access to prenatal care, IVF, other types of pregnancy care, and it can also look like having agency over what the birthing process can look like. And then next we have the right to have a child, which can look like the continuous access to letting folks know what contraceptives are available to them, what information around abortions is available to them, and transparency around abortion care. And then lastly, we have the right to parent in safe and healthy conditions. So what this looks like is folks just knowing, like, you know, what it's gonna look like after they have their child. Will they have different, like, support groups with them? Will they have resources for food, for daycare services? Like, what's gonna happen when they go back to the workforce? That's what that can look like.
So LGBTQ plus youth face unique structural barriers when it comes to reproductive justice. I'm sure that comes to no surprise to us in this room. And all of the institutions that youth must go through, whether that's educational, medical, even the family institution itself, there are biased policies and practices that are baked into them. So, for example, many schools use abstinence-only curricula to discuss sexuality education. There's a collaborative call to action titled LGBTQ plus Youth Need Inclusive Sex Education. It's been published by multiple organizations, including Psychus, Listen, Planned Parenthood, and more. And in there they stated that abstinence-only curricula sends students messages that promotes fear of LGBTQ plus attraction, reinforces gender stereotypes, mandates heterosexual marriage by implying that or outright stating, not even implying, that the only way that you can have safe sex is within a heterosexual marriage, and disparaging single-parent families. So just taking that in, does that sound like anybody's health education that you received in school? Yeah, definitely sounds like mine. So, you know, that's still the case today, unfortunately. A lot of our youth are still going through this. But these institutional biases that our youth go through in these systems, you know, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. These institutional biases are held up by biased individuals. So in addition to curricula that at best excludes LGBTQ plus youth and at best, or at worst, demonizes them, the individual health class teacher may believe that there are no LGBTQ plus students in their class. So why teach about it? Why advocate for changes to the curriculum? So it keeps the problem turning. And these institutional and individual biases that LGBTQ plus youth come up against can result in inconsistent access to education and resources. So while the system overall, maybe the school overall has some biased policies and practices, maybe there are a couple teachers here and there that are trying their best to make it better, to throw in a little inclusion here, throw in some representation there, but that creates this patchwork of information for LGBTQ plus youth. Like, if you're lucky enough, you have the cool health teacher who will talk about your identity, right? Or who will talk about your existence at all. And then maybe in the next year, you have a teacher who completely ignores it. So there's these giant gaps that youth experience in their education that can lead to really harmful effects for them, just missing out on crucial information about their well-being.
Okay. So, poor health outcomes are not the failing of our youth, rather they're the failing of complex intertwined systems that don't allow us to put youth's needs at the center of their care experiences. So just looking and thinking about this quote, right, I think for me it brings up just like the different types of institutional biases that exist. And I think it's important for us to also think about how, you know, youth don't know what they don't know. And so they may not realize the full extent of what information is being kept from them. They may not know, and unfortunately we can't expect them to bring those things to the table. We can't expect the youth we work with to just already know like what they want, what their boundaries are, what consent looks like, what confidentiality rights they're entitled to. They probably don't know those things, and we have to unfortunately make the assumption that they need more information.
So this is a perfect place for us as adult allies to the youth to step in, right? Just like Nako said, youth don't know what they don't know. But us as adult allies, maybe we do know, right? And maybe we're assuming that they know. So let's stop all the assuming. So we have some areas here where LGBTQ plus youth have some significant sexual and reproductive health needs. I just want to note here, we're going to talk about most of these in further detail, but I want to note that we're using the term sexuality education intentionally instead of sex education, sex ed, sexual health education. Similar to how we're using the term reproductive justice, sexuality education encompasses sexual health as well as relationships and identity. And these are crucial aspects of sexuality itself that all youth are generally left to figure out for themselves, often using media or the adult role models in their life to figure out how it's supposed to look. But for LGBTQ plus youth, they don't really have those positive media representations of LGBTQ plus relationships. A lot of LGBTQ plus youth don't even know LGBTQ plus adults, much less have relationships modeled for them. I know for myself, working with younger youth, middle and high schoolers, I've been told many times that I'm the first bisexual adult that they've ever met, sometimes even the first LGBTQ plus adult they've ever met, period. So if I'm coming into their life between like 12 and 17 years old, and they're not even getting to see my relationship in day-to-day and see how that can look, like where are they getting information about how relationships are supposed to look? Nako, has that been true of like your experience working with youth?
Yeah, I say the same for me with the youth that I've worked with, or just even community members. You know, I oftentimes come across folks who are like, wow, how can you be so vulnerable and open with folks and like not be afraid? And I think that unfortunately we're not in a space yet where most of us feel like we can come out and be open to like community members about our sexual orientation, our gender identities, what pronouns we use, and so like all those things. Like for me, I think it's, as a provider, sometimes it's been really jarring to be the first person that uses they them pronouns for younger folks, because like I think I see the impact, you know, and I think that's when I start to feel like, oh, like this is what my work is all about, you know, just seeing making sure folks know that they can see people like me and like I'm older than them and I'm alive and doing well.
Yes, that's so important. And I'm really glad that I like that you brought up how it's jarring as a provider. I'm sure that people relate to that in this room sometimes when you're like, oh my God, is this really what you're still going through? Like, not that we're not aware of what's happening, but sometimes you see it so clearly in front of you, you're like, damn. It reminds me of working with the youth, and they told me that they had never even heard the term bisexual until they saw it on like a school survey about like, what's everyone's sexuality in the school? I think it was like a survey put on by the GSA, and like, bisexual was an option. They were like, I don't even know what that means. I'm like, they were like in 9th grade. Like, that's so wild to me that, you know, like these are the big cracks that our youth fall through.
Can I actually add something? I was gonna say, like, I think for me also, like I said, when I was going to high school, I went to public school here in Los Angeles. I never, ever, ever, throughout my 4 years here, met someone who used they, them pronouns. And it wasn't until like I got to college that I realized, oh, that was like a possibility. And like, that's actually how maybe I would like to live my life, you know? And I think it was hard for me to come to that realization that all those other years, like me being a child, were lost. I didn't have anyone to look up to for that. I didn't even know that was an option. So I think like just knowing that folks really are going through that process, like you said, ages 12 through 17 is like really important and to our work.
So we can see the real life repercussions of, you know, this lack of information, this lack of representation, all of this, and the rates that LGBTQ plus youth experience intimate partner violence. So according to the National LGBTQ Institute on Intimate Partner Violence, LGBTQ plus youth experience teen dating violence at 2 to 3 times the rate of their heterosexual cisgender peers. There are certainly many factors that contribute to this, not only a lack of sexuality education, but it certainly plays a significant role. So like I said, we're going to talk about some more of these up on the screen in further detail, but just want to also shout out that youth are in need of some kind of public funding program. If they are not able to afford the care and the education that they need, there needs to be some way that they can get access to those resources. And it doesn't have to be like a formal government program. It could just be a mutual aid program that like we set up within our own communities, and we all chip in and we all are helping the youth, right? We don't have to make it too complicated. And we'll talk about trustworthy online information, consent confidentiality rights, and then making information free and accessible. So I'm gonna hand it to Nako for consent confidentiality rights.
So I think when we think about consent and confidentiality rights, I think sometimes it can seem like an unapproachable topic, like we almost don't want to engage with like that clouded idea of whatever that means. But I think something that maybe might open us up to the idea of having those conversations with youth is just remembering that they're way more likely to open up to us and engage with us when their confidentiality is assured. So, you know, if you let folks know, like, hey, like everything you say in this room, like I'm not gonna go out and tell other people, it stays between us two, it can really change the dynamic of the space. It can really change the dynamic of the waiting room even, or just like wherever y'all meet. And you know, just letting folks know that there are California laws in this state that hold youth's confidentiality rights sacred. So, you know, like if they tell you something about their sexuality or their sexual orientation, letting them know that, you know, it stays between y'all, it's not gonna leave the room, and that it's actually like the law. The law protects them and their right to, for the conversation not to leave the room. And you know, you can also do this by including youth in the process, by explaining like what's going on, explaining what their rights are through like plain language and not using like big words, big terminology, just like talking to them in the same way that they talk to you, and leveling the field out.
So another way that we can do this is through providing that comprehensive sexuality education. I didn't know this actually until I started putting together this presentation, that comprehensive sexuality education is an international human right recognized by the United Nations. So like, feel free to have that in your back pocket when you're talking to people who don't think that youth should be entitled to this, right? That makes me feel pretty empowered to provide this. But even knowing that this is an international human right, we know that not all youth receive this education. As we touched on earlier, many youth go through that abstinence-only curricula in school in place of comprehensive sexuality education. And that curricula is certainly not designed with LGBTQ plus youth in mind. It does not provide that research and relevant information that youth need.
So let's look at some stats together, y'all. So in a GLSEN's National School Climate Survey of LGBTQ plus middle and high school students, about a quarter of the youth surveyed said they had never received any school-based sex education. And of those who did, only about 8.2% said that it was LGBTQ inclusive. And after that, so even though like this kind of looks like a lot, we can imagine that in these studies, you know, it was reported that only 20% of Black LGBTQ plus youth and 13% of Latinx LGBTQ plus youth received sex education that they found relevant to their identities. So we're seeing that, you know, they're not feeling represented, they're not seeing people who look like them represented in the media that they're bringing to sex education, or like the pamphlets they're bringing, or like even the folks who are coming in, you know, they don't look like they're of community. So it's hard for them to engage and feel like they can connect with the material. Additionally, only 13% of bisexual youth and 10% of transgender and gender expansive youth receive personally relevant sex ed. So again, you know, folks aren't feeling like they can connect with the material because they don't feel like visualized, they don't see representation happening in the room. I just want to ask, for folks that are in the room with us today, how many of y'all went to public school here in the United States? Okay, so I'm seeing a lot of raised hands. And of the people who raised their hands, how many of y'all remember relevant sex education? Relevant as in like now in your adulthood, you remember what happened in the room and you use those those tips daily, or just like at least, you know, at least like in your day-to-day experiences. How many? I see like 1 to 2 people, but there were a lot of those hands.
Some tips that you are using.
Yeah, that's okay. I hope so, you know, but unfortunately that's just not the case, right? And so like I think with the youth that I've worked with, I've also heard that, you know, they aren't taking away many things from the sessions that are happening. I personally remember like when it was my turn to get sex education in middle school, I think like I just remember, you know, like I came in, the lights turned off, and then we just kind of watched like a 2-hour clip on like biology, and I was like, what is this? And that was it. No one checked in on me afterwards. No one was like, hey, did you understand the material? Like, do you need anything else? No one asked me if who I was having sexual relationships with, if I was even in a relationship at the time. Like, those things were not brought up. There was no facilitation happening, no engagement, no conversation. So I think, like, just keeping those things in mind when we're working with youth is really important. Yeah, it's just important.
Yeah, I love that picture that you made. Like, the lights turn off, that's so real. I really relate to that. It makes me think of, like, when I was in 6th grade and I had, like, my first health class experience. We watched a video where if there weren't people, it was like cartoon frogs going through puberty. And the period products, I remember one was mentioned, like, a sanitary napkin, and for years I thought that they were napkins and not pads. And I'm like, how hard is it? Anyway, okay, let me not take myself on a tangent here. Okay, so we're gonna talk about what makes sexuality education personally relevant to youth. So we're gonna break it down with this example. So this is an example of an illustration that youth may see in formal school-based sexuality education. Is this like something that looks kind of like what we saw in school? Yeah. Yeah. So I know that for myself, this is actually even better than what I experienced in my health class. I mean, I already talked about the frogs. But I went to a Catholic high school for a brief period of time. And my health class education was basically being taught about how sinful sexuality is and having sex is. And the only time that LGBTQ plus identities were brought into the room were to talk about how, you know, it's not the fault of the person to have that attraction, but it is their fault if they act on it. And I was like, damn. I'm going through a lot right now. As like a 13-year-old, I don't know how to process that, right? And then I never really received any further education from that. So, you know, this is not an uncommon story. I'm not saying this to make myself like, you know, some kind of sob story. Like, certainly I'm sure other people in the room kind of relate to that experience. So when we're going through our sexuality education with our youth and we have resources like this, you know, even this example is not really great. Like, looking at this picture, there's so many things that stand out to me about it, so many. First of all, there's super binary cis sexist language up here talking about how boys turn into men and girls turn into women. And the body is shown in 2 stages of puberty with this really interesting use of the word normal that accompanies this image of the body. So what type of body exactly are we being told is normal? Someone who's cisgender, someone who's not intersex, someone who's slim, able-bodied, white. There's also a complete void of any kind of cultural context on this person. So if I'm a youth, I'm taking this in, and I'm being told this is normal, but this doesn't apply to me, I'm so checked out instantly, right? Like, who relates to this person? Who is this person? I don't know that person. So when we're like going through educational content, and like Nako was saying, we don't see ourselves in it, our youth don't see themselves in their own curriculum they're going through, why would they pay attention? Right? Why would they feel that it's personally relevant to them? It goes back to those statistics of youth saying, like, I don't think that anything that I learned actually applies to what I need in my life. So inclusive curriculum isn't just an empty buzzword. It's really crucial to engaging youth and making content memorable. Like what Nako was saying, like, who can remember a tip? It's like, I literally can only remember things that traumatize me. Like, I do not remember a helpful tip to save my life. So we really, really need that inclusive education. And inclusion can be as simple as visually representing different kinds of people, right? Just making that one image on like a worksheet just a little bit better. Curricula should actually show differences in bodies and include them throughout the content as examples of healthy youth and adults, not just like an exception to what could happen to a person, or like a footnote, or like, oh, isn't this interesting? Some people are transgender. Like, it should be like baked in throughout the content. And not just as, you know, we don't want to just see what the creator of that content has deemed normal and is like telling us is normal. So maybe some of us here have heard about the mirrors and windows approach to education. This asserts that youth should see themselves reflected like they're looking in a mirror. So they should have a representation of their own race, their own culture, gender, experiences, as well as windows into other people's experiences to see how other people go about the world. And this approach not only builds self-esteem and pride in youth when they see themselves represented or their own culture represented, it also builds empathy and helps youth have like a broader understanding of humanity when they see other people. So this really emphasizes the importance of representing people in a respectful, well-rounded way. And anytime we include discussion about a population that's been marginalized in society, it's an opportunity for historical context. So what has this group of people gone through collectively? What are issues going on for that group right now that are a continuation of that history? Like, sexuality education is a great opportunity for that. If we talk about HIV/AIDS in our sexuality curricula, we should also talk about the treatment that gay and bisexual men endured by healthcare professionals, from the government itself, how Black and Latino, bisexual, and gay men are still disproportionately affected by HIV/AIDS. We should talk about how to have safe anal sex. We should talk about PrEP and PEP. It's like there's so many paths we can go down just with that one little opening, right? And I'm sure you're all like, Keilani, that sounds so easy. I don't even know why you're telling me this right now. So again, like I said at the beginning, sometimes this feels really daunting when it's like, just do everything. And you're like, okay. It's like really not that easy. So again, we're gonna break it down, and one way that you can start to navigate having these conversations with youth is by taking a trauma-informed approach. So I'm gonna throw it to Nako for the trauma-informed approach.
Okay, so let's define trauma-informed care, y'all. So I think trauma-informed care is kind of like realizing the widespread impact of trauma, but also creating the pathways towards recovery and making sure that the folks that we work with know that we're also advocating for them towards that, towards while they're walking that path. So trauma-informed care has a couple of components, and we're going to go through them together. So the first is that throughout the organization, patients and staff feel physically and psychologically safe. So what that means is like the people that work there feel like it's an environment that they feel safe in. They feel like coming to work in every day. They don't feel scared. They don't feel worried. They're not nervous about like, you know, the dynamics that exist between like a supervisor and like coworkers. You know, they're ready to go. They feel excited about working with a team. Decisions are made with transparency and with the goal of building and maintaining trust. So trust is something that is built, right? It's not something that you can't just say, I trust you, and that's it. You have to build the trust. It might take a long time, it might take work, but you want to be able to build that with your team and with the community there, so that then the folks that you're serving feel that. They feel that you and your team trust each other. They feel like they can come to you and also trust you with information. This goes back to like the confidentiality conversation we had earlier, right? The youth we work with, they want to know that they can trust you and that they can talk to you about issues that are concerning them. Next we have is also power differences. So again, just acknowledging that between staff, clients, and organizational staff, there's shared decision making. So the team is working together to make decisions, and including clients as well. All of these things, just to recap, can be considered safety, choice, collaboration, and trustworthiness. So again, trauma-informed care makes sure that the clients are taken care of, but also that we're taking care of ourselves as well.
So we have another quote here that says, a program, organization, or system that is trauma-informed realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths for healing, recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in staff, clients, and others involved with the system, and responds by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, practices, settings, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. So much happens in this quote, but it's so good. So something that stands out to me in this quote is thinking about just having like the starting point of recognizing that everybody that we interact with in our work has the potential for having experienced trauma in their lives. So when we enter into these conversations about sexuality and relationships and sexual behavior and attraction and all of these things that are rolled up in reproductive justice, like entering that conversation from that really compassionate and sensitive point of view, thinking like, I'm not gonna assume just because the person I'm talking to is 13 years old that they don't have any trauma around this. I'm gonna go in thinking, I don't know what's happened to this person, but I wanna make sure that this conversation is as safe and helpful for them as I can make it as an adult ally to them. So that's where that trauma-informed care really comes in on that side. Would you like to add anything about this quote?
I would like to add about the quote. So Keilani and I mostly work with professional adults on our day-to-day, but sometimes we still work with youth at the center. And oftentimes, you know, things will come up in the classroom, and it's okay. But I think like part of resisting re-traumatization and also carrying that trauma-informed lens is just like doing that self-assessment when I come into the class. Like, how am I feeling? What energies am I carrying with me? Like, what is happening at home that I need to make sure like I take care of before I come into the space? Because for me, I feel like the youth that I work with, like I'm so passionate about helping them and supporting them and like advocating for them that I have to prioritize those other things before I step into the classroom. Because things can come up, and they have. And if I'm not ready for that, if I'm not working from a space of trauma-informed care, I'm not gonna know what to do. And that's where things slip up, that's where accidents can happen, or that's where maybe I won't be able to show up for the folks that are in the setting. So I think like Keilani and I have been in situations in the past where, you know, we're relying on each other to make sure that we're practicing that trauma-informed care, and we're reeling it in, and we're making sure it's staying in the space. And it's very intentional. There's a lot of care there. It's not careless. We like come into the space, and we're making sure that the youth that we're with feel the care every day, every time that they're with us. Until they leave, and even after. So that means like sometimes like checking in or sending an email or talking to their other case managers and saying, hey, you know, X youth was experiencing these things. What's going on? What do you know? What can we do for them? How can we support each other? I think that's also the other side of the coin of trauma-informed care. Did you want to add anything else? So we're going to end with talking about how to have conversations with youth. We've kind of already touched on this already, but we're just going to recap a little bit. So again, you want to let the youth initiate and take the lead. So, you know, not forcing folks to make decisions based off of what you think is right. Just letting them know what the options are, and just being there for them, listening to them, and you know, just paving the way for them to make those choices, but not making it for them. And then you want to check your biases. So a lot of times we don't know what biases we're coming in with because we don't want to do that self-assessment, because if we're being honest, sometimes that hurts to check your biases and be like, damn, like I can't believe I'm still bringing this into the classroom, like, you know? And it's sometimes painful work to check yourself at the door, you know? Or when you have a thought about like a youth and you're like, oh, I should not be thinking that. Like sometimes you have to check yourself, and it's hard and difficult, but it's important in terms of like how to have conversations with youth. You want to be able to explain confidentiality agreements in plain language. We talked about that already, but you know, just using the language that they're using, reflecting that back to them, and making sure that you know, the field is leveled with them. You want to ask for consent. So you know, before just like starting a conversation about sexual health, you don't want to just like go into it. You want to ask like, hey, like, how are you feeling today? Are you ready for this conversation? Like, what's going on? What are you holding? Like, what can I hold with you? And then leave the door open. If a youth that feels like they don't want to talk about it, or they're not ready to engage with you about certain types of material, it's okay. You know, let them know that they can come back to your office, or they can email you whenever they need to. And yeah, just making sure that they feel like they can come back at any time without any repercussions.
So, we'll wrap up with some best practice guidelines. Just want to say, of course, none of this work is easy, even without factoring in all of the labor and research and finessing that goes into trying to achieve reproductive justice with our youth. Facing the very loud opposition to comprehensive sexuality education and just reproductive justice in general in our culture right now is in and of itself a pretty massive task, like just having that emotional capability to take on that fight. So there's certainly not one simple way to, you know, resist all of this, but it doesn't mean that there is no way to resist. In fact, like Nako said, we've already covered a couple ways to do this during this presentation. More than any of us adults in the room, LGBTQ plus youth are really in the belly of the beast of this issue right now, sitting through this curriculum, hearing a lot of this hateful rhetoric, and feeling even more powerless than some of us may feel as adults. And part of this could be that they don't know what rights they have. So just want to go back again to remind us all that we can educate youth on their rights. We have the ability to find that information in a way that is maybe more streamlined than they do, and to bring that information to them. But we also want to know when to get out of the driver's seat, right? So we bring them the education, but this is their life. We want to give them that autonomy. So we got to know when to also step into the passenger seat, right? So it's also about collaborating and communicating with the youth that we serve to determine what would be most effective for their situation. It's not my job to come in and tell them what works for them. It's my job to listen to them and what they tell me. And that collaboration goes beyond just working with the youth themselves. The ACLU recommends that one of the most effective ways to bolster sexuality education in our local areas or our states is to build these really strong community alliances. So we can create or join existing coalitions of educators, healthcare professionals, parents, youth themselves, anybody in the community who's really interested in protecting the rights of our youth. It's just really important to remember that we're all stronger together. So having our multiple perspectives, our multiple lived experiences, informed views really increases our ability to effectively counter and myth-bust arguments, as well as monitor what's going on for the youth. You know, if we have more eyes on like what our youth are going through, then we have more opportunities to intervene and to protect our youth. And maybe not all of us here are in a position to overhaul our local school district's sexuality education program to like get youth personally into healthcare settings. But we can think outside the box, right? We can be creative. So LGBTQ plus youth already turn to non-school sources to find a lot of this information. They often turn to their peers and turn to the internet, neither of which are particularly reliable resources all of the time. So when we are getting information out to our youth, we can get that accurate information out. We can share with what resources we have with them. And we can go beyond just like, you know, posting an infographic on social media, and that is no shade. I love to post an infographic on social media. I am up in Canva every day of my life. But we can like write letters to the editor. We can lead workshops. I saw online to like create a voter guide for school board elections, and that was just like, that just sounds so good to me. Like, dang, that sounds like good work right there. So we can get creative with what we can do, right? We all have multiple perspectives that we're coming in at this. So if you get shut down on one path, you can always go down another and keep that hope alive. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for listening. Here are our email addresses if you would like to ask us